Sarah Martinez had always believed that hard work would eventually pay off. At 28, she had spent the last 4 years working as a night shift supervisor at Henderson Manufacturing, a small factory that produced automotive parts just outside Phoenix, Arizona. The job wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills and helped her support her younger brother Miguel, who was studying engineering at the local community college. On that particular Tuesday evening in March, Sarah arrived at the factory as usual at 10:30 p.m., 30 minutes before her shift began. She liked to arrive early to review the production schedules and check in with the day shift supervisor about any issues that might need attention during the night. The parking lot was nearly empty, with only a few cars belonging to the security guard and the cleaning crew who worked until midnight. The Henderson Manufacturing Building was a single-story concrete structure that had seen better days. Paint was peeling from the exterior walls, and several of the overhead lights in the parking lot flickered constantly. But, inside, the machinery hummed with efficiency, producing thousands of small metal components that would eventually find their way into cars and trucks across the country. Sarah pushed through the heavy glass doors and waved to Jerry, the security guard who had been working there longer than anyone could remember. Jerry was in his 60s, with gray hair and kind eyes behind thick glasses. He had become something of a father figure to Sarah, especially since her own father had passed away 3 years earlier from a heart attack. "Evening, Sarah," Jerry called out from behind his desk. "Everything's been quiet today. Johnson said the new orders came in this afternoon, so you might have a busy night ahead." Sarah nodded and made her way to the small office she shared with the other supervisors. The room was cramped, with 2 metal desks pushed against opposite walls and filing cabinets that reached nearly to the ceiling. She hung her jacket on the back of her chair and pulled on her safety vest, the bright orange fabric worn thin from countless washings. The night shift crew began arriving shortly before 11 p.m. There were 12 workers in total, mostly men in their 40s and 50s who had been with the company for years. Sarah had earned their respect through her fairness and willingness to work alongside them when production deadlines were tight. She knew each of their names, their family situations, and their concerns about the future of the company. Carlos Rivera, a machinist who had been with Henderson for 15 years, was usually the first to arrive. He was a quiet man who took pride in his work and had trained several of the younger employees over the years. Tonight, he seemed more subdued than usual as he clocked in and headed to his workstation. "Everything okay, Carlos?" Sarah asked as she made her rounds to check on each work area. He paused and looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Just heard some rumors today, that's all. Probably nothing to worry about." Sarah felt a familiar knot form in her stomach. Rumors at Henderson Manufacturing were rarely good news. Over the past year, there had been whispers about declining orders, increased competition from overseas manufacturers, and the possibility that the company might need to make significant changes to remain profitable. As the night progressed, Sarah tried to push her concerns aside and focus on the work at hand. The production line was running smoothly, with workers efficiently operating the cutting machines, presses, and assembly stations that transformed raw metal into finished products. The familiar sounds of machinery and the occasional conversation between workers created a steady background noise that Sarah had grown to find comforting. Around 2 a.m., she took her dinner break in the small employee cafeteria. The room had 3 round tables and a collection of mismatched chairs, along with a microwave, refrigerator, and coffee maker that seemed to be perpetually brewing a pot of coffee strong enough to wake the dead. Sarah had brought a sandwich from home, as she did most nights, and ate while reviewing the production reports from the previous week. The numbers weren't encouraging. Orders had declined by nearly 20% over the past 6 months, and several of their longtime customers had begun sourcing parts from cheaper suppliers overseas. Sarah understood the business well enough to know that these trends were troubling for a small company like Henderson. She was joined in the cafeteria by Maria Santos, one of the assembly line workers who had become a close friend over the years. Maria was a single mother with 2 teenage daughters, and she often worked overtime to help pay for their school expenses and activities. "Sarah, can I ask you something?" Maria said as she sat down with her own dinner. "Do you think the company is in trouble? People are talking, and I'm getting worried about my job." Sarah chose her words carefully. She didn't want to add to Maria's anxiety, but she also couldn't lie to someone who had become like family to her. I know there have been some challenges with orders lately, but management hasn't told us anything definitive. I think as long as we keep doing good work and meeting our deadlines, we should be okay. Maria nodded, but Sarah could see the worry in her eyes. She knew that most of the workers lived paycheck to paycheck, just as she did. Losing this job would be devastating for all of them. The rest of the shift continued without incident until about 6 a.m., when Sarah noticed Tom Henderson, the company owner, entering the building. This was unusual, as Tom typically didn't arrive until mid-morning. He was a man in his early 60s who had inherited the business from his father and had always seemed genuinely concerned about his employees' welfare. Tom walked directly to the supervisor's office and knocked on the door. Sarah opened it to find him standing there with an expression she had never seen before, a mixture of sadness and resignation that made her heart skip a beat. "Sarah, could I speak with you for a moment?" he asked quietly. She followed him into the office and closed the door behind them. Tom sat down heavily in one of the chairs and rubbed his forehead with both hands before looking up at her. "I'm afraid I have some difficult news," he began. "We received notice yesterday that our biggest customer, Atlantic Motors, is terminating their contract with us. They're moving their business to a supplier in Mexico who can produce the same parts for about 40% less than our costs." Sarah felt the room spinning slightly as the implications of this news sank in. Atlantic Motors represented nearly 60% of Henderson Manufacturing's business. Losing that contract would be catastrophic. "What does this mean for the company?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Tom sighed deeply. "I've been trying to find alternatives, other customers, ways to cut costs, anything to keep us afloat. But the reality is that we can't survive without that contract. I'm going to have to close the company, Sarah. This will be the last shift." The words hit her like a physical blow. Sarah had always known that the manufacturing industry was challenging, but she had believed that Henderson's reputation for quality and reliability would see them through difficult times. The thought of telling the workers, many of whom had become like family to her, that they were losing their jobs was almost unbearable. "When will you tell the others?" she managed to ask. "I plan to speak with everyone at the end of the shift. I wanted you to know first because you're going to have to help me get through this. These people trust you, and they're going to need someone they can lean on during the next few hours." Sarah nodded, though she felt completely unprepared for what lay ahead. She thought about Maria and her daughters, about Carlos and his pride in his craftsmanship, about Jerry who was probably too old to easily find another job. Each of these people would be facing uncertainty and financial hardship because of circumstances completely beyond their control. The final 2 hours of the shift seemed to crawl by. Sarah found it difficult to concentrate on routine tasks, knowing that everything around her was about to change forever. She watched her colleagues working diligently at their stations, unaware that this would be their last night at Henderson Manufacturing. At 7 a.m., as the day shift workers began arriving, Tom asked everyone to gather in the main production area. Sarah stood beside him as he addressed the group, her heart breaking as she watched the expressions on familiar faces change from curiosity to shock to despair. Tom explained the situation honestly and with obvious emotion. He talked about the contract cancellation, the financial impossibility of continuing operations, and his genuine regret about having to close the company. Several of the workers asked questions about severance pay, unemployment benefits, and the possibility of finding buyers for the business, but the answers provided little comfort. When the meeting ended, people stood around in small groups, talking quietly among themselves. Some seemed angry, others appeared to be in shock, and a few were already making phone calls to family members. Sarah tried to offer words of encouragement and support, but she felt as lost as everyone else. Maria approached her with tears in her eyes. "What am I going to do, Sarah? I can't afford to be without work, not even for a few weeks." Sarah hugged her friend, wishing she had answers or solutions to offer. "We'll figure something out," she said, though she wasn't sure how. "Maybe there are other companies hiring, or programs that can help with job training." As people began to leave the building, Sarah remained behind to help with the shutdown procedures. Machines needed to be properly secured, inventory had to be counted, and various administrative tasks required attention. The work helped keep her mind occupied, but she couldn't escape the reality that this chapter of her life was ending abruptly and, without warning. Jerry stopped by the office before heading home. "I just wanted to say it's been a pleasure working with you, Sarah. You're a good supervisor and a good person. I know things seem pretty dark right now, but I have a feeling you're going to land on your feet." His words were kind, but Sarah felt anything but optimistic about the future. At 28, she would be starting over again, looking for work in an economy where manufacturing jobs were becoming increasingly scarce. She had some savings, but not enough to support both herself and Miguel for very long without income. By 9 a.m., the building was empty except for Sarah and Tom, who was in his office making phone calls to customers and suppliers. Sarah gathered her personal belongings from the supervisor's office, including a small cactus plant that had somehow managed to thrive under the fluorescent lights and a coffee mug that Miguel had given her for her birthday. As she walked through the production area one last time, Sarah tried to memorize the details of a place where she had spent so much of her life over the past 4 years. The smell of machine oil and metal shavings, the sound of her footsteps echoing off the concrete floor, the way the morning sunlight streamed through the high windows, all of it would soon be just memories. She thought about all the late nights she had worked to meet difficult deadlines, the friendships she had formed with her colleagues, and the sense of accomplishment she had felt when production targets were exceeded. Despite the long hours and sometimes stressful conditions, Henderson Manufacturing had been more than just a job to her. It had been a place where she felt valued and respected, where her hard work was recognized and appreciated. Now, as she prepared to leave for the last time, Sarah couldn't help but wonder what lay ahead. The manufacturing industry in Phoenix was struggling, and jobs with comparable pay and benefits were hard to find. She would need to file for unemployment benefits, update her resume, and begin the often discouraging process of job hunting. But perhaps most difficult was the knowledge that 12 other families were facing the same uncertainty. These were people who had trusted the company and worked hard for years, only to have their livelihoods disappear overnight due to economic forces beyond their control. Sarah felt a deep sense of responsibility toward them, even though there was little she could actually do to help. As she reached her car in the parking lot, Sarah turned back to look at the Henderson Manufacturing building one more time. In a few weeks or months, it would probably be empty, with for sale or for lease signs posted outside. Another small business would have become a casualty of global economic pressures, and another group of workers would join the ranks of those seeking new opportunities in an increasingly competitive job market. Sarah started her car and began the drive home to the small apartment she shared with Miguel. She had no idea that in just a few hours, her life would take a turn so unexpected and dramatic that losing her job at Henderson Manufacturing would seem like a minor setback in comparison. The sound of helicopters was still hours away, but the events that would bring them to her neighborhood were already set in motion, waiting to unfold in ways that would change everything she thought she knew about her future. Sarah arrived at her apartment complex just after 10 a.m., feeling emotionally and physically exhausted from the night's events. The Sunset Gardens apartments weren't much to look at from the outside, a collection of two-story tan buildings arranged around a small courtyard with a pool that rarely worked and landscaping that survived more through neglect than care. But the rent was affordable, and it was close enough to both Henderson Manufacturing and Miguel's college that it had made sense when she first moved there. She climbed the exterior stairs to apartment 2B, fumbling with her keys as she tried to process everything that had happened. The morning sun felt unusually warm against her face, and she realized that for the first time in 4 years, she wouldn't need to sleep during the day to prepare for another night shift. The thought should have been liberating, but instead it felt like another reminder of how much her life had just changed. Miguel was sitting at their small kitchen table when she entered, books and papers spread around him as he worked on assignments for his engineering courses. At 22, he was 4 years younger than Sarah but had always been remarkably focused and determined when it came to his education. Their father's death had motivated him even more to succeed, knowing that Sarah was making sacrifices to help him achieve his dreams of becoming a civil engineer. He looked up as she came through the door, immediately noticing her expression. "How was work? You look like you've seen a ghost." Sarah set her purse down and sat across from him at the table. She had been dreading this conversation during the entire drive home, knowing that Miguel would be as affected by her job loss as she was. His tuition for the next semester was due in 6 weeks, and, without her steady income, paying for his education would become much more difficult. The company is closing, Miguel. Last night was my final shift. Miguel's pen froze halfway through writing an equation. He stared at her for a long moment, as if waiting for her to say she was joking or that she had made some kind of mistake. When she didn't speak, he carefully set the pen down and leaned back in his chair. Closing? What do you mean closing? Sarah explained about Atlantic Motors canceling their contract and Tom Henderson's decision to shut down the business. As she talked, she watched Miguel's expression change from confusion to concern to something that looked like guilt. Sarah, maybe I should drop out for a semester or two, he said when she finished. Get a full-time job and help out until you find something new. Absolutely not, Sarah replied firmly. You're too close to finishing your degree to stop now. We'll figure something else out. But, even as she said the words, Sarah wasn't sure what that something else might be. She had been working since she was 16, first part-time jobs during high school and, then, full-time positions after graduation. The job at Henderson had been the best she'd ever had, with decent pay, health benefits, and opportunities for overtime when they needed extra money. The apartment suddenly felt very small and quiet. Without the constant background noise of the factory, Sarah found herself noticing sounds she usually missed: the neighbor's television through the thin walls, cars starting up in the parking lot, children playing at the nearby elementary school that was just letting out for spring break. She decided to take a shower and try to get some sleep, hoping that things might seem clearer after a few hours of rest. But, as she stood under the hot water, Sarah couldn't stop thinking about the uncertain future that lay ahead. She had always prided herself on being responsible and prepared, but this situation was completely beyond her control. After her shower, Sarah lay in bed staring at the ceiling. Her bedroom was small but comfortable, with a window that looked out over the apartment complex courtyard. Usually she would close the blackout curtains and sleep soundly until late afternoon, but today her mind was racing too much for sleep to come easily. She thought about the other workers from Henderson Manufacturing and wondered what they were doing right now. Carlos probably went home to his wife and explained the situation over breakfast. Maria was likely trying to figure out how to tell her daughters that money would be even tighter than usual. Jerry might be sitting in his backyard, wondering if anyone would hire a security guard who was nearing retirement age. Around noon, Sarah gave up on sleep and got dressed again. She made a cup of coffee and sat down at the kitchen table with Miguel, who was still working on his assignments but clearly having trouble concentrating. I've been thinking, Miguel said without looking up from his textbook. Maybe I could get a student loan for the rest of my education. That way you wouldn't have to worry about my tuition while you're looking for work. Sarah considered this suggestion. She had always tried to help Miguel avoid student loans, knowing that many college graduates were struggling with debt that took years to pay off. But, given their current situation, it might be the most practical solution. Let's see what options are available, she agreed. But, first, I need to figure out my own next steps. She spent the afternoon on her laptop, researching job opportunities in the Phoenix area. Manufacturing positions were limited, and most of the available openings were with larger companies that paid less than Henderson had. There were some possibilities in retail and customer service, but those jobs typically offered lower wages and fewer benefits. Sarah also looked into unemployment benefits, trying to understand how much assistance she might be eligible for and how long it would last. The process seemed complicated, with multiple forms to fill out and requirements to meet, but it would provide some income while she searched for new employment. As evening approached, Miguel started cooking dinner, his specialty of spaghetti with meat sauce that had become a regular meal in their household because it was both inexpensive and filling. Sarah appreciated his efforts to maintain normalcy, even though they were both clearly worried about what the future would hold. They were just sitting down to eat when Sarah's phone rang. The caller ID showed Maria's number, and Sarah answered immediately, hoping her friend wasn't calling with more bad news. Sarah, I'm sorry to bother you, Maria said, her voice sounding strained. But I just got a call from Carlos, and he heard something strange. He said there were some kind of government vehicles at the Henderson building this afternoon, and people in suits were going through the office areas. Sarah felt a new wave of concern. Government vehicles? What kind of government vehicles? He wasn't sure exactly. Maybe FBI or something like that. Carlos drove by around 3 o'clock because he forgot his toolbox in his locker, and he said there were several black SUVs parked outside and men carrying boxes out of the building. This information was puzzling and somewhat alarming. Sarah couldn't imagine why federal agents would be interested in Henderson Manufacturing. The company had always seemed to operate above board, paying taxes and following all the regulations she was aware of. Did Carlos see Tom Henderson there? That's the weird thing, Maria continued. Carlos said Tom's car wasn't in the parking lot, but the building was definitely open and there was a lot of activity inside. After ending the call, Sarah relayed the conversation to Miguel, who looked as confused as she felt. They speculated about possible explanations. Maybe there were environmental concerns about the manufacturing processes, or perhaps the company had been involved in some kind of business irregularity that Sarah hadn't been aware of. The uncertainty was troubling, especially since Sarah realized she might need Tom Henderson as a reference when applying for new jobs. If the company was under investigation for something, it could complicate her efforts to find employment elsewhere. That night, Sarah had difficulty falling asleep again. Every time she closed her eyes, her mind would start racing through possibilities and concerns. She worried about money, about Miguel's education, about finding a new job that would provide enough income and benefits. But now she was also troubled by the mystery surrounding Henderson Manufacturing and what the presence of federal agents might mean. Around 2 a.m., she gave up on sleep and went to the kitchen to make some tea. As she stood by the window waiting for the water to boil, Sarah noticed that the apartment complex was unusually quiet. Even the neighbor's dog, who typically barked at every small sound, was silent. She was about to return to bed when she heard a distant rumbling sound that seemed to be growing louder. At first she thought it might be a freight train, as the railroad tracks ran about a mile east of the apartment complex. But, as the sound grew closer and more distinct, Sarah realized it was helicopters. Not just one helicopter, but several of them, flying low and fast. The sound was becoming loud enough to rattle the windows slightly, and Sarah could see flashing lights in the distance moving in what appeared to be a coordinated pattern. Miguel appeared in the kitchen doorway, looking confused and slightly alarmed. "What's all that noise?" Sarah pointed toward the window. "Helicopters. At least 3 of them, maybe more." They both pressed their faces to the window, trying to see what was happening. The helicopters seemed to be heading toward the industrial area where Henderson Manufacturing was located, though it was difficult to tell exactly from their vantage point. "Do you think this has something to do with what Carlos saw today?" Miguel asked. Sarah didn't know, but the timing seemed too coincidental to ignore. First the federal agents at the Henderson building, and now helicopters flying toward the same area in the middle of the night. Whatever was happening, it was clearly bigger than the simple closure of a small manufacturing company. The sound of the helicopters continued for several more minutes before gradually fading into the distance. Sarah and Miguel remained at the window, but they couldn't see any clear indication of where the aircraft had landed or what their purpose might have been. "Should we drive over there and see what's going on?" Miguel suggested. Sarah considered this idea but decided against it. If federal agents were involved in some kind of investigation or operation, civilian observers probably wouldn't be welcome. Besides, getting involved in whatever was happening might create complications she couldn't afford while looking for new employment. But, as she finally returned to bed, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that the events of the past day were connected in some way she didn't yet understand. Losing her job had seemed like a personal setback, but now it appeared that Henderson Manufacturing might have been involved in something much more complex and potentially serious. She lay in bed listening to the distant sounds of the city, cars on the nearby highway, the occasional siren, the hum of air conditioning units working against the warm Arizona night. But her mind kept returning to the sound of those helicopters and the questions they raised. What had Carlos really seen at the Henderson building? Why were federal agents interested in a small automotive parts manufacturer? And what was significant enough to warrant helicopter operations in the middle of the night? Sarah realized that her job loss might have been about more than just economic factors and cancelled contracts. There might have been other reasons why Atlantic Motors had suddenly terminated their relationship with Henderson Manufacturing, reasons that had nothing to do with pricing or competition from overseas suppliers. As dawn began to break through her bedroom window, Sarah finally drifted off to sleep, but her dreams were filled with the sound of rotating helicopter blades and images of men in dark suits carrying boxes from her former workplace. She had no idea that the answers to her questions would soon change everything she thought she knew about Henderson Manufacturing, Tom Henderson, and her own future in ways she could never have imagined. The helicopters would return, and, when they did, Sarah Martinez would find herself at the center of events that would transform her life from unemployed factory supervisor to something she had never dreamed of becoming. But, first, she would need to discover the truth about what had really been happening at Henderson Manufacturing during all those night shifts when she thought she was simply overseeing the production of automotive parts. Sarah woke up around noon the next day feeling more tired than when she had gone to bed. The events of the previous day and night had left her mentally exhausted, and the sound of helicopters kept echoing in her memory. Miguel had already left for his morning classes, leaving a note on the kitchen table saying he would be back by 3 p.m. and that he had made coffee for her. She poured herself a cup and sat down to check her phone for any missed calls or messages. There were 3 missed calls from Maria, 2 from Carlos, and 1 from a number she didn't recognize with a 602 area code, which indicated it was local to Phoenix. Sarah decided to return Maria's call first, hoping her friend might have more information about the strange activity at Henderson Manufacturing. "Sarah, thank goodness you called back," Maria said immediately upon answering. "Something really weird is going on. Carlos went back to the Henderson building this morning, and it's completely surrounded by police cars and federal agents. They've got the whole area blocked off, and no one is allowed to get close to the building." This news was both alarming and confusing. Sarah had assumed that whatever had happened the night before was a brief investigation, but the continued presence of law enforcement suggested something much more serious was taking place. Did Carlos talk to any of the officers? Did they tell him what was going on? He tried, but they just told him it was an ongoing federal investigation and that he needed to leave the area. But, Sarah, here's the really strange part: Carlos saw Tom Henderson being escorted out of the building in handcuffs. Sarah nearly dropped her coffee cup. Tom Henderson arrested? The man who had seemed so genuinely upset about having to close the company and lay off his employees was apparently involved in something criminal enough to warrant federal charges. Are you sure it was him? Carlos is positive. He said Tom looked scared and confused, nothing like the confident businessman we all knew. Whatever Tom was involved in, it must have been pretty serious for the FBI to arrest him. After ending the call with Maria, Sarah sat in stunned silence trying to process this information. Throughout her 4 years at Henderson Manufacturing, Tom had always seemed like a straightforward businessman who cared about his employees. He had occasionally worked late nights alongside the production crew when deadlines were tight, and he had always been fair about overtime pay and vacation requests. But, apparently there had been another side to Tom Henderson and his business that Sarah had never suspected. She began to wonder if the company's financial troubles were real, or if they had been a cover story for something else entirely. Her phone rang again, showing the unfamiliar 602 number that had called earlier. Sarah hesitated for a moment before answering, wondering if it might be a reporter or someone else connected to whatever was happening at Henderson Manufacturing. "Hello, is this Sarah Martinez?" asked a woman's voice that sounded professional and official. "Yes, this is Sarah. Ms. Martinez, my name is Agent Jennifer Walsh with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I need to speak with you about your employment at Henderson Manufacturing. Would it be possible for us to meet this afternoon?" Sarah's heart began racing. She had no idea why the FBI would want to talk to her, but she assumed it must be connected to whatever investigation had led to Tom Henderson's arrest. "Am I in some kind of trouble?" Sarah asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "No, Ms. Martinez, you're not in trouble. We believe you may have information that could be helpful to our investigation. We'd prefer to meet in person if that's convenient for you." They arranged to meet at a coffee shop called Desert Beans that was about 10 minutes from Sarah's apartment. Agent Walsh said she would be there at 3 p.m. and that she would be accompanied by another agent. Sarah spent the next 2 hours trying to prepare herself for the meeting, wondering what kinds of questions they might ask and what information she might have that would be useful to a federal investigation. Miguel returned home just as Sarah was getting ready to leave for the coffee shop. She quickly explained about the phone call and the planned meeting, watching as his expression grew increasingly concerned. "Should you have a lawyer with you?" Miguel asked. "I mean, even if you're not in trouble, maybe you should have someone there to protect your interests." Sarah had considered this possibility, but she didn't know any lawyers and couldn't afford to hire one. Besides, Agent Walsh had assured her that she wasn't a suspect in whatever was being investigated. "I think I'll be okay," Sarah said, though she wasn't entirely convinced. "If they ask me anything that makes me uncomfortable, I can always stop the interview and leave." Desert Beans was a small, locally owned coffee shop with mismatched furniture and artwork by local artists covering the walls. Sarah arrived a few minutes early and chose a table in the back corner where they could talk privately. She ordered a latte and tried to calm her nerves while waiting for the FBI agents to arrive. At exactly 3 p.m., two people in business suits entered the coffee shop and looked around. Agent Walsh was a woman in her early 40s with short brown hair and an efficient manner, while her partner was a tall man who introduced himself as Agent David Rodriguez. They both ordered coffee and sat down across from Sarah at the small table. "Thank you for meeting with us, Ms. Martinez," Agent Walsh began. "As I mentioned on the phone, we're investigating activities at Henderson Manufacturing, and we believe you may have observed things during your employment there that could be relevant to our case." "I'm not sure what I could tell you that would be helpful," Sarah replied honestly. "I worked the night shift, so I mostly dealt with production schedules and supervising the manufacturing crew. I didn't have much involvement with the business side of the company." Agent Rodriguez leaned forward slightly. "That's actually why we want to talk to you. We're particularly interested in the night shift operations and whether you noticed anything unusual about the work being done during those hours." Sarah thought back over her 4 years at Henderson Manufacturing, trying to remember if there had been anything out of the ordinary about the night shift activities. For the most part, the work had been routine operating machines to cut and shape metal parts according to specifications provided by customers like Atlantic Motors. "Can you tell me what kinds of unusual activities you're looking for?" Sarah asked. "I mean, what would be considered suspicious?" Agent Walsh and Agent Rodriguez exchanged a glance before she responded. "We're investigating the possibility that Henderson Manufacturing was being used to produce items other than automotive parts. Items that might have been shipped to unauthorized recipients or used for purposes other than legitimate automotive manufacturing." This suggestion was shocking to Sarah. She had assumed that all the work being done at Henderson was exactly what it appeared to be, manufacturing metal components for cars and trucks. The idea that the company might have been producing something else, possibly something illegal, had never occurred to her. "I supervised the production of thousands of parts over the past 4 years, Sarah said slowly. "Most of them were small metal pieces, brackets, fittings, housing components, things like that. Everything we made seemed to match the specifications and drawings provided by the customers." "Did you ever notice any orders that seemed unusual in terms of their size, timing, or the level of secrecy surrounding them?" Agent Rodriguez asked. Sarah considered this question carefully. Most of Henderson's orders had been routine, with regular customers placing predictable quantities of standard parts. But, as she thought about it, she began to remember some orders that had been handled differently than others. "There were occasionally special orders that came in," she said slowly. "Tom Henderson would sometimes handle these personally, and the paperwork would be different, usually just handwritten notes instead of the standard order forms we used for regular customers." Agent Walsh leaned forward with obvious interest. "Can you tell us more about these special orders? How often did they occur, and what kinds of parts were involved?" "Maybe once or twice a month, usually small batches of parts that were more complex than our typical work. Tom would provide the specifications directly to Carlos Rivera, our lead machinist, and Carlos would work on those orders himself instead of assigning them to other workers. Did you ever see the finished parts from these special orders? Agent Rodriguez asked. Sarah tried to remember. Sometimes Carlos would show me the completed pieces before they were packaged for shipping. They were usually precision-machined components, more detailed than our regular automotive parts. But I always assumed they were just for specialty vehicles or custom applications. The agents continued asking questions about the special orders, the shipping procedures for those items, and whether Sarah had ever noticed anything suspicious about Tom Henderson's behavior. As the conversation continued, Sarah began to realize that these special orders might have been the focus of the federal investigation. Ms. Martinez, Agent Walsh said after about 30 minutes of questions, "We believe that some of the special orders you've described may have involved the production of components for weapons systems that were being illegally exported to foreign countries." Sarah felt as if the air had been knocked out of her lungs. Weapons components? She had been supervising the production of parts that might have been used in weapons that could potentially harm people? "I had no idea," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I thought we were just making automotive parts. If I had known that anything illegal was going on, I would have reported it immediately." "We believe you," Agent Rodriguez said gently. "Our investigation indicates that the weapons components production was limited to the special orders that were handled directly by Henderson and Rivera, and that most of the employees, including yourself, were unaware of the true nature of those items." Agent Walsh pulled out a business card and handed it to Sarah. "We may need to speak with you again as our investigation continues, but, for now, we want you to know that you're not in any trouble. Your cooperation today has been very helpful." As the agents prepared to leave, Sarah asked the question that had been bothering her since learning about Tom Henderson's arrest. "What's going to happen to the other employees from Henderson Manufacturing? Are they going to be investigated too?" "We don't believe any of the other employees were knowingly involved in the illegal activities," Agent Walsh replied. "However, we may need to speak with some of them to gather additional information about the company's operations." After the agents left, Sarah remained at the coffee shop for another hour, trying to process everything she had learned. The job she had thought was simple and straightforward had apparently been a cover for illegal arms trafficking. Parts she had helped produce might have ended up in weapons that could harm innocent people in other countries. The guilt was overwhelming, even though she knew rationally that she couldn't have known what was really happening. She thought about all the nights she had worked so hard to ensure that production quotas were met and quality standards were maintained, never realizing that some of that production was contributing to illegal activities. When Sarah finally returned home, Miguel was waiting anxiously for news about the meeting. She explained everything the FBI agents had told her, watching as his expression changed from concern to shock to anger. "Sarah, none of this is your fault," Miguel said firmly when she finished. "You were doing your job honestly, and you had no way of knowing that Henderson was involved in anything illegal. Don't blame yourself for something you couldn't have prevented or detected." But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she should have been more observant, should have asked more questions about the special orders, should have been more suspicious about the secrecy surrounding certain aspects of the business. As night supervisor, she had felt responsible for everything that happened during her shift, and learning that illegal activities had been taking place under her supervision was devastating. That evening, Sarah tried to focus on practical matters like job searching and filing for unemployment benefits, but she found it difficult to concentrate. Every time she thought about potential employers, she wondered how she would explain her previous job and whether the Henderson manufacturing investigation would affect her ability to find new employment. Around 10 p.m., her phone rang with a call from Carlos Rivera. His voice sounded shaky and upset when she answered. "Sarah, the FBI came to my house this afternoon," he said. "They asked me a lot of questions about the special orders Tom used to give me. I told them everything I knew, but I'm scared about what's going to happen next." Sarah tried to offer reassurance, but she was dealing with her own fears about the situation. "Agent Walsh told me that they don't think the regular employees were involved in anything illegal. They understand that we were just doing our jobs." "But what if someone doesn't believe that?" Carlos asked. "What if people think we should have known what was really going on? My family has lived in this community for 20 years.
If people think I was involved in weapons trafficking, it could ruin our reputation. This concern was something Sarah hadn't fully considered. Even if the FBI cleared all the Henderson employees of wrongdoing, the court of public opinion might be less forgiving. Once the investigation became public knowledge, people might assume that anyone who worked at Henderson Manufacturing must have known about the illegal activities. As she prepared for bed that night, Sarah reflected on how much her life had changed in just 3 days. She had gone from being an employed factory supervisor to being unemployed and potentially connected to a federal investigation involving illegal weapons trafficking. The sound of helicopters that had puzzled her 2 nights earlier now made perfect sense. They had been part of a major law enforcement operation targeting her former workplace. But, as overwhelming as these developments were, Sarah had no idea that her involvement in the Henderson Manufacturing case was just beginning. The information she had provided to the FBI agents was more valuable than she realized, and her unique perspective as night shift supervisor would soon make her an important witness in a case that involved not just Tom Henderson and Carlos Rivera, but an international network of arms dealers and corrupt officials. The helicopters had been just the beginning of a story that would ultimately change Sarah's life in ways she could never have imagined, opening doors to opportunities and challenges she had never dreamed of facing. 3 weeks had passed since Sarah's meeting with the FBI agents, and the Henderson Manufacturing investigation had become front-page news throughout the Phoenix area. Local television stations ran stories about the weapons trafficking scheme, featuring aerial shots of the shuttered factory and interviews with former employees expressing their shock and disbelief about the illegal activities. Sarah had done her best to avoid the media attention, declining requests for interviews and asking friends and family not to discuss her involvement with reporters. But the story had taken on a life of its own, with investigators revealing that Henderson Manufacturing had been part of an international network that supplied weapons components to several countries in violation of federal export laws. The financial impact of losing her job had begun to affect every aspect of Sarah's life. Her unemployment benefits provided only a fraction of her previous income, and she had been forced to withdraw money from her savings account to pay rent and other essential expenses. Miguel had managed to secure a student loan for the remainder of his education, but Sarah still felt the weight of responsibility for their household finances. Her job search had been largely unsuccessful. Several potential employers had expressed concerns about her association with Henderson Manufacturing, even after Sarah explained that she had been unaware of any illegal activities. The weapons trafficking scandal had created a shadow over anyone who had worked at the company, making it difficult to move forward with normal employment prospects. On a Thursday morning in April, Sarah was sitting at her kitchen table reviewing job listings online when her phone rang with a call from Agent Walsh. They had spoken twice since their initial meeting, with the FBI agent calling to ask follow-up questions about specific dates and production schedules related to the weapons components investigation.
"Good morning, Ms. Martinez," Agent Walsh said. "I hope I'm not disturbing you. I wanted to speak with you about a development in our case that might be of interest to you."
Sarah felt the familiar knot of anxiety in her stomach that had become common whenever she received calls related to the Henderson investigation.
"Of course. What can I help you with?" "Actually, this time I'm calling because we might be able to help you," Agent Walsh said.
"The FBI is looking to fill a position in our Phoenix field office, and, based on your cooperation with our investigation and your background, you might be an excellent candidate." This suggestion was so unexpected that Sarah thought she might have misunderstood.
"I'm sorry, did you say a position with the FBI?"
"Yes. We need someone with manufacturing experience to work as a technical analyst in our white-collar crime division. The job would involve reviewing industrial operations and identifying potential violations of federal export laws and weapons trafficking regulations. Your knowledge of manufacturing processes and your attention to detail during our investigation have impressed the supervisors here."
Sarah was speechless.
The idea of working for the FBI had never occurred to her, and she wasn't sure she was qualified for such a specialized position. "Agent Walsh, I appreciate the suggestion, but I don't have a college degree or law enforcement experience.
Are you sure I would be suitable for this kind of work? The position doesn't require a degree, and we can provide all necessary training.
What we need is someone who understands manufacturing operations from a practical standpoint and who has demonstrated integrity and observational skills." you've shown both of those qualities during our investigation. Agent Walsh explained that the position would involve traveling to manufacturing facilities throughout the southwestern United States to conduct compliance reviews and assist with investigations similar to the Henderson case. The work would be challenging and would require security clearance, but it offered excellent benefits and the opportunity to make a meaningful contribution to national security.
I'd like you to think about it, Agent Walsh said. If you're interested, we can arrange for you to visit our field office and learn more about what the job would entail. After ending the call, Sarah sat in stunned silence. The possibility of working for the FBI seems surreal, like something that happened to other people rather than unemployed factory supervisors from Phoenix. But, as she considered the offer, she began to see how her experience at Henderson Manufacturing might actually be valuable to federal investigators. Miguel returned from his classes that afternoon to find Sarah pacing around their apartment, clearly agitated about something. When she explained about Agent Walsh's call and the FBI job offer, his reaction was immediate enthusiasm.
"Sarah, this could be amazing," he said.
"You'd be doing important work, helping to prevent other companies from getting involved in illegal activities like Henderson did. And the benefits and job security with the federal government would be incredible."
"But what if I'm not good at it?" Sarah asked. "What if I don't understand the technical aspects or make mistakes that could affect important investigations?"
Miguel sat down beside her on the couch. "You were supervising complex manufacturing operations for 4 years, and you noticed things about Henderson that helped the FBI with their case.
You're more qualified than you think."
Sarah spent the weekend researching FBI careers and trying to imagine herself as a federal agent. The more she learned about the Bureau's mission and the types of work involved in white-collar crime investigations, the more intrigued she became. The Henderson case had shown her how manufacturing companies could be used for illegal purposes, and she found herself wanting to help prevent similar situations from occurring. On Monday morning, Sarah called Agent Walsh to express her interest in learning more about the position. They arranged for her to visit the FBI field office the following day for a detailed discussion about the job requirements and application process.
The FBI building in Phoenix was an impressive modern structure with multiple levels of security.
Sarah had to present identification and pass through metal detectors before being escorted to Agent Walsh's office on the 4th floor. The building buzzed with activity, with agents and support staff moving purposefully through hallways lined with official photographs and federal law enforcement memorabilia.
Agent Walsh introduced Sarah to Special Agent Robert Chen, who supervised the white-collar crime division.
Agent Chen was a man in his late 40s with an analytical demeanor who had spent 15 years investigating financial fraud and export violations.
Ms.
Martinez, Agent Chen said as they sat in a conference room, "Agent Walsh has told me about your cooperation with the Henderson investigation and your background in manufacturing supervision. We believe those skills could be very valuable in our work." He explained that the technical analyst position would involve reviewing manufacturing processes, identifying potential violations of export control laws, and providing expert testimony in court cases when necessary. The work would require extensive travel, sometimes to international locations, and would involve collaborating with agents from other federal agencies. "The job can be demanding," Agent Chen continued, "but it offers opportunities for professional growth and the satisfaction of knowing you're protecting national security interests. We provide comprehensive training in federal law, investigation techniques, and the technical aspects of weapons systems and export controls."
Sarah asked numerous questions about the training process, work environment, and career advancement possibilities.
She learned that the position was part of a new initiative to recruit technical experts from private industry to help combat increasingly sophisticated white-collar crimes.
"What made you consider me for this position?" Sarah asked. "There must be many people with more extensive technical backgrounds." Agent Walsh responded, "Your practical experience in manufacturing oversight is exactly what we need.
Academic knowledge is valuable, but you understand how production operations actually work on a day-to-day basis. You know what normal manufacturing processes look like, which means you can identify when something is abnormal or suspicious." The meeting lasted nearly 2 hours, covering everything from salary and benefits to security clearance requirements and the application timeline. Sarah learned that if she decided to pursue the position, she would need to complete extensive background investigations, psychological evaluations, and specialized training programs. As Sarah prepared to leave, Agent Chen handed her a folder containing detailed information about the position and the application process. "Take some time to consider this carefully," he said. "It's a significant career change, and we want to make sure you're fully committed before beginning the application process." That evening, Sarah spread the FBI materials across her kitchen table and studied them carefully while Miguel worked on his engineering assignments. The position offered a salary significantly higher than what she had earned at Henderson Manufacturing, along with comprehensive health benefits, retirement planning, and opportunities for advancement within the federal government. But, perhaps most importantly, the work represented a chance to make a meaningful contribution to society. Instead of simply supervising the production of automotive parts, she would be helping to protect national security and prevent weapons from reaching unauthorized recipients.
"What do you think?" Miguel asked during a break from his studies. "I think I want to try," Sarah said slowly. "It's scary because it's so different from anything I've ever done, but it feels like the right opportunity at the right time." "Then, you should go for it. The worst thing that could happen is they decide you're not suitable for the position, and you'd be in the same situation you're in now. But, if it works out, you could have a career that's both personally fulfilling and financially stable." Sarah spent the next few days completing the extensive application paperwork and scheduling the required interviews and examinations. The background investigation process was thorough, with FBI agents interviewing her former supervisors, coworkers, neighbors, and friends to verify her character and reliability. Carlos Rivera, who was also going through his own legal proceedings related to his unknowing involvement in the weapons components production, provided a strong reference for Sarah. Despite his own troubles, he emphasized her integrity and her dedication to doing quality work. The psychological evaluation was particularly challenging, involving several hours of interviews and written assessments designed to determine her suitability for law enforcement work. Sarah had never considered herself particularly suited for investigative work, but the psychologist noted her analytical thinking and attention to detail as positive indicators. 6 weeks after her initial meeting with Agent Walsh, Sarah received a call informing her that she had been accepted for the technical analyst position. The news was both exciting and terrifying, as it meant she would soon be entering a completely new career field with responsibilities she could barely imagine. Her training would begin in 8 weeks at the FBI Academy in Quantico, Virginia, where she would spend 3 months learning about federal law enforcement procedures, investigative techniques, and the technical aspects of export control violations. After completing the academy training, she would return to Phoenix to begin her work with the White-Collar Crime Division. Miguel was thrilled when she shared the news. "I'm so proud of you, Sarah. A year ago, if someone had told you that you'd be working for the FBI, you would have thought they were crazy." "I still think they might be crazy for hiring me," Sarah replied with a laugh. "But I'm excited to see what happens." As Sarah prepared for her move to Virginia for training, she reflected on the extraordinary series of events that had led to this opportunity. Losing her job at Henderson Manufacturing had initially seemed like a devastating setback, but it had ultimately opened doors to possibilities she had never considered. The sound of those 3 helicopters on that dark night in March had marked the beginning of a transformation that would take her from unemployed factory supervisor to federal agent. The illegal activities at Henderson Manufacturing had destroyed the careers and reputations of Tom Henderson and several others, but, for Sarah, the investigation had become the catalyst for an entirely new life. She thought about her former co-workers who were still struggling to find new employment and rebuild their careers after the scandal. Maria had eventually found a job at a retail store, though it paid significantly less than her Henderson Manufacturing position. Several other workers remained unemployed, unable to overcome the stigma associated with their connection to the weapons trafficking case. Sarah realized how fortunate she had been to have agents who recognized her potential value to their organization. Her cooperation with the investigation, combined with her manufacturing experience and personal integrity, had created opportunities that she could never have anticipated. On her last night in Phoenix before leaving for FBI training, Sarah stood on the balcony of her apartment looking out over the city lights. Somewhere in the distance, the Henderson Manufacturing building sat empty and dark,
a reminder of how quickly circumstances could change and how little control people sometimes had over the events that shaped their lives. But Sarah no longer felt like a victim of those circumstances. The helicopters that had once seemed ominous and threatening now represented the beginning of a journey that would give her life new purpose and meaning. She would be using her skills and experience to protect others from the kind of deception and illegal activity that had unknowingly touched her own life. As she packed her belongings for the move to Virginia, Sarah felt a mixture of anxiety and excitement about the challenges that lay ahead. FBI training would be demanding, and the work of a technical analyst would require her to develop new skills and knowledge. But, for the first time in months, she felt genuinely optimistic about the future. The sound of 3 helicopters had changed everything, setting in motion a series of events that would transform an unemployed factory worker into a federal agent dedicated to protecting national security. Sarah Martinez was ready for her new beginning, knowing that sometimes the most unexpected opportunities arise from the most difficult circumstances.